China built the world's most advanced megacity from nothing in just 40 years. Shenzhen went from a fishing village of 30,000 people to a metropolis of over 12 million, and its economy now generates more wealth than the entire country of Sweden. You heard that right. One city, smaller than Los Angeles, outproduces a developed European nation of 10 million people. What took London 400 years, New York 200, Shenzhen did in a single lifetime. And the way they did it will change how you see every city you've ever lived in. Here's how it happened. Year 0. To understand what China actually built, you first have to see what was there before. It's 1980. You're standing on the southern coast of China, just across the border from Hong Kong. And what you see is almost nothing. A cluster of fishing villages. Rice paddies stretching to the horizon. Dirt paths where roads should be. 30,000 people who have lived this way for generations. The air smells like salt water and farmland. There is no skyline. There is no highway. There is no future here, at least not yet. Meanwhile, just across the border, Hong Kong is gleaming. Skyscrapers, ports, capital flowing in from every direction, and Beijing is watching. China, in 1980, is a country still recovering from decades of economic isolation. Mao's era had sealed it off from global trade, foreign investment, and market economics. The country is poor. The infrastructure is crumbling, and the leadership knows it. Deng Xiaoping has just taken power, staring at a nation that has fallen catastrophically behind the rest of the world. He needs a solution, and he needs it fast. So he makes a decision that will change urban history forever. On August 26, 1980, Shenzhen becomes China's first special economic zone. In a communist nation, this one patch of land will operate under capitalist rules. Foreign investment welcomed, private business permitted, tax incentives flowing, and every government resource poured into building this place from the ground up. But here's what most people miss about that moment. Deng Xiaoping wasn't just opening a free trade zone, he was running an experiment. If Shenzhen worked, if China could prove it could build a world-class city from scratch, the model could be replicated everywhere. Shenzhen wasn't the destination. It was the proof of concept. And the clock had already started. But nobody, not even Deng Xiaoping, fully understood what it would take to actually pull it off. The blueprint. Most cities don't get planned. They get accumulated. London grew street by street over centuries, layering roads on top of old cow paths, building sewers decades after the streets above were already packed with people. New York's grid wasn't drawn until 1811, a reactive attempt to organize growth already threatening to spiral out of control. Almost every great Western city was built the same way, chaotically, incrementally, one problem at a time. China looked at that model and rejected it entirely. When Shenzhen became a special economic zone, the government didn't send in construction crews first. They sent in planners, thousands of them. And before a single foundation was poured, they designed an entire city not for the 30,000 people already there, but for the tens of millions they intended to bring. This is where China's centralized government became its single greatest engineering advantage. In a democracy, building a city requires negotiation, land acquisition, environmental reviews, zoning disputes. A subway line in the West can spend a decade in planning before a single tunnel boring machine hits the ground. China had none of those constraints. The state owned the land, all of it. No private owners to negotiate with, no injunctions to survive. The government drew a line on a map. The subway goes here, the highway goes here, the financial district goes here, and it simply happened. What Western cities spend decades arguing about, Shenzhen's planners decided in months. But the real genius wasn't the speed of the decisions. It was what they decided. Shenzhen's master plan ran on a doctrine called the three simultaneities. Design, construction, and infrastructure would not happen in sequence, they would happen in parallel. While architects were still drawing buildings, engineers were laying utility corridors beneath the ground. Those buildings would stand on. While towers rose in the north, subway tunnels were being bored in the south. While one district was being finished, the next was already being framed. Nothing waited for anything else. And on paper, that sounded like genius. In practice, It was the most logistically terrifying construction coordination problem any government had ever attempted. One miscalculation, a utility corridor dug in the wrong place, a subway route that conflicted with a foundation grid, a district built before its power supply was ready, and the entire plan could unravel faster than it was being assembled. But they didn't miscalculate. And buried inside that master plan was something even more remarkable. The planners didn't design for the city Shenzhen would be in 10 years. They engineered for the city it would become in 50. Utility corridors dug wide enough for infrastructure that didn't exist yet. Subway routes mapped through empty farmland that wouldn't be developed for 2 decades. Highway interchanges built at intersections where there was nothing, because the plan said a city would be there and the infrastructure needed to be ready. They weren't building a city. They were building the skeleton of one and betting everything that the flesh would follow. That was the gamble, and this was just the beginning of how audacious it would get. The build. You have a plan. You have the land. You have the government's full weight behind you. But a plan is just paper, until someone picks up a tool and starts building. And what happened next in Shenzhen wasn't just construction. It was the most ambitious, most coordinated, most relentless building operation in the history of human civilization. In the early 1980s, construction crews began arriving by the thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Migrant workers from Hunan, Sichuan, Guizhou, men and women who had grown up farming rice paddies, now handed hard hats and put to work building a city that would become the envy of the modern world. At its peak, over 300,000 construction workers were active in Shenzhen simultaneously, not in rotation, not across a weekly schedule, simultaneously all at once, across dozens of active construction zones. 300,000 workers is roughly the entire population of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, all showing up to the same job site. You heard that right. But raw manpower alone doesn't explain the speed. The speed came from a construction methodology China had been quietly perfecting, one the rest of the world was completely unprepared for: prefabrication. Not the modest modular homes and pre-poured slabs the West was used to. China industrialized prefabrication at a scale no one had ever attempted. Entire building components, walls, floor sections, staircases, facade panels, even bathroom pods manufactured off-site in massive factories, engineered to millimeter precision, loaded onto trucks, and delivered to sites ready to be lifted into place. Instead of pouring concrete floor by floor and waiting for it to cure, China was assembling skyscrapers the way you assemble furniture. The pieces arrived ready. The crew's job was to connect them. And when pieces arrive ready, you don't build one floor every 2 weeks. You build one floor every 2 to 3 days. That was Shenzhen Speed. It became a cultural standard, a badge of honor that crews competed to meet and beat. Project managers tracked output the way a factory tracks units per hour. Shift commanders ran morning briefings like military officers. Progress was measured not in weeks, but in floors. And falling behind didn't just mean a delayed building, it meant falling behind the master plan. The master plan waited for no one. Construction sites never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, floodlit through the night. Concrete batching plants were built directly on site because waiting for off-site delivery cost hours, and hours were unacceptable. Just-in-time systems tracked material inventory in real time, ensuring steel, glass, and components arrived at the crane hook exactly when needed. And above all of it, the tower cranes. At the height of Shenzhen's construction boom, the city operated more tower cranes simultaneously than the entire United States and Europe combined. So densely clustered that crane operators had to coordinate swing arcs to avoid collisions. The skyline under construction didn't look like a city being built. It looked like a machine building a city. But the buildings were only half the job. The invisible city. Every great city has 2 versions of itself. The one you can see the skyline, the streets, the lights, and the one you can't. The buried arteries of pipes, cables, and tunnels that keep everything above ground alive. And here's what most people never consider. The invisible city is harder to build than the visible one. The infrastructure beneath your feet has to be engineered into the ground before the city above it gets too heavy and too dense to touch. Get the invisible city wrong, and the visible one collapses. When Western cities built their subways, they did it the hard way. London's underground was dug in the 1860s through a city already packed with buildings and people. New York's tunnels were blasted through Manhattan bedrock, with streets in full use above. Every line, every station, had to be surgically inserted into a city that didn't want to be disturbed. It took decades. It cost fortunes. Shenzhen's subway wasn't being inserted into an existing city. It was being built alongside one. Tunnel boring machines had open ground. Cut-and-cover construction didn't have to shut down packed commercial streets. The streets above were often still being graded when the tunnels beneath were already being dug. So China deployed tunnel boring machines across multiple lines, simultaneously boring north while boring south, boring east while boring west, so the network grew in every direction at once. The result? Over 300 stations, more than 300 miles of track, built in under 20 years. A subway system that would take most Western cities half a century. Shenzhen finished before most of its current residents had even arrived. But the subway was only the beginning of what was happening underground. And what came next was the part that most cities never even think to attempt. Shenzhen's planners had built something into the original master plan that almost no other city had attempted at this scale: integrated utility tunnels. Massive underground corridors, wide enough to walk through, housing every utility the city needs. Power lines, water mains, fiber optic cables, gas lines, telecommunications all running together beneath the streets. In every other city, when a water main breaks, crews tear up the road. When power cables need upgrading, the street gets ripped open. When new fiber goes in, construction barricades appear for weeks. The street becomes the enemy, constantly destroyed and rebuilt at enormous cost. Shenzhen's utility tunnels make that almost entirely obsolete. Every system runs through an accessible corridor. Maintenance crews can upgrade power lines, reroute water mains, install new fiber without ever touching the street above. The city's infrastructure can evolve without the city above it ever knowing. Above ground, over 1,300 miles of roads and elevated expressways were laid. Elevated sections built specifically to preserve ground-level flow as density increased. And at the city's edge, the port of Yantian was engineered in parallel, today ranking among the top 10 busiest container ports on the planet, the physical pipeline through which Shenzhen's output flows to the rest of the world. The invisible city and the visible city rose together, floor by floor, tunnel by tunnel, mile by mile. And when the world finally saw what China had built, something no one outside China had fully anticipated had already happened. Shenzhen hadn't just built a city. It had built the most technologically advanced urban environment on the planet. The tech layer. When most people think about the cutting edge of the tech world, they think Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Palo Alto, the gleaming campuses of Google and Apple and Meta. And for decades, that image made sense. But something shifted, and most of the Western world missed it. Shenzhen didn't just build a city. It built an ecosystem, dense, layered, self-reinforcing, that Silicon Valley simply cannot replicate. Because Silicon Valley designs things. Shenzhen designs things, builds them, tests them, manufactures them at scale, and ships them to the world, all within the same city limits. The gap between an idea and a physical product that takes months in California takes days in Shenzhen. Start with hardware. Shenzhen produces roughly 90% of the world's consumer electronics, not just assembling, engineering, prototyping, refining, mass producing. The ecosystem of suppliers and manufacturers is so dense that an entrepreneur can walk into Huaqiangbei, Shenzhen's legendary electronics market, and source every component needed to build a smartphone within a single city block. Nowhere else on Earth can you do that. This concentration of capability gave birth to some of the most consequential companies of the 21st century. Huawei, founded here in 1987, just 7 years after the city itself was created. Tencent, behind WeChat, born here. DJI, which manufactures over 70% of the world's commercial drones, headquartered here. BYD, now the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer by volume, built here. These are not small companies. These are global forces grown from the same soil, in the same city. But the companies are just the surface. Shenzhen was one of the first cities on Earth to achieve full 5G coverage across its entire urban area. not partial coverage blanket 5G across every district, every neighborhood, every street. That network density isn't a luxury. It's the nervous system every other smart city system plugs into. The AI-powered traffic management system has no equivalent in the Western world. Every major intersection feeds real-time data into a centralized platform that monitors, predicts, and adjusts flow continuously. Signal timing doesn't run on a fixed cycle. It responds to actual conditions, second by second, rerouting traffic before congestion builds. The system doesn't just react, it anticipates. The power grid uses AI to monitor consumption across the entire city in real time, predicting demand spikes before they happen, redistributing load to prevent blackouts before they occur. The grid doesn't just deliver power, it thinks. And then there's what most people in the West haven't fully reckoned with yet. Shenzhen operates one of the most extensive facial recognition and surveillance networks on Earth. Hundreds of thousands of cameras, feeding an AI platform capable of identifying individuals in real time across a city of 12 million people within seconds. The scale of data being processed is almost incomprehensible. Through WeChat and Alipay, residents pay taxes, renew licenses, access medical records, report infrastructure issues, and receive government services all from a single app. No lines, no paper forms. The interface between citizen and city is a smartphone screen. And perhaps the most extraordinary piece of it, the one almost no one outside urban planning circles talks about, Shenzhen maintains a real-time digital twin of itself. A complete, continuously updated three-dimensional simulation of the entire city. Every building, every road, every utility corridor, every transit line. Engineers test infrastructure upgrades in the simulation before touching the physical city. Emergency responders run crisis scenarios before deploying resources. Planners model the impact of new development on traffic, energy, and population density not by guessing, but by simulating. Shenzhen doesn't just run a city. It runs a live model of one. All of it sitting on top of physical infrastructure engineered into the city's bones from day one. The utility corridors dug in the 80s now carry the fiber feeding the surveillance network. The subway, bored in the 90s, now moves the engineers building what comes next. Everything connected, everything intentional, nothing accidental. But a city this advanced, built this fast, what does it actually produce? The answer will stop you cold. The economic engine, Shenzhen's GDP is $560 billion a year. Let that number live for a second, because it doesn't fully land until you put it next to something real. Sweden, a developed, highly educated nation of 10 million people with decades of industrial history, generates roughly $540 billion a year. Shenzhen, a city that didn't exist 40 years ago, just beat it. You heard that right. One city, built from rice paddies in a single lifetime, outproduces an entire Scandinavian nation. And it's not slowing down. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what the Special Economic Zone designation actually unlocked. It wasn't just tax breaks and foreign investment, though. Those mattered. It was the deliberate creation of conditions that exist almost nowhere else on Earth simultaneously. Low corporate taxes, relaxed trade regulations, accelerated customs processing, direct access to global shipping lanes through one of the world's busiest ports, and a workforce of millions, hungry, skilled, and showing up every single day. Capital didn't just flow into Shenzhen, it flooded. Within a decade of the Special Economic Zone designation, multinational corporations from the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Europe were establishing manufacturing operations inside the city. They came for the labor costs. They stayed because of something they hadn't expected: the ecosystem. The density of suppliers, manufacturers, engineers, and logistics networks meant that a company operating in Shenzhen could move faster, iterate faster, and produce cheaper than anywhere else on the planet. And then, the homegrown companies started winning. Huawei crossed $100 billion in annual revenue. Tencent became one of the most valuable companies on Earth. BYD overtook Tesla in global electric vehicle sales volume. DJI captured over 70% of the global consumer drone market. These weren't flukes. These were the inevitable products of an ecosystem so deep, so dense, and so deliberately engineered that world-beating companies couldn't help but emerge from it. But here is the piece of the story that most people miss entirely. Shenzhen doesn't just generate wealth for itself, it funds China's broader national ambitions. The tax revenue, the export income, the foreign exchange generated by this one city flows outward into infrastructure projects across the country, into Belt and Road investments across the four-city developing world, into the research and development budgets of the next generation of Chinese technology already being built right now. Shenzhen is not just an economic success story, it is the engine that powers the machine. And what China built with that knowledge, next city by city, continent by continent, is the part that changes everything you thought you knew about who shapes the world. Here is what China walked away from Shenzhen knowing. They knew how to mobilize 300,000 workers simultaneously and keep them productive across dozens of active construction zones. They knew how to prefabricate building components at industrial scale and assemble skyscrapers at a pace the rest of the world had never seen. They knew how to bore subway tunnels beneath a city while the city was still being built above them. They knew how to engineer utility corridors that would serve a population 50 years into the future. They knew how to layer 5G networks, AI traffic systems, smart grids, and digital twins on top of physical infrastructure and turn a city into a living, thinking machine. They had compressed centuries of urban development into 40 years. And now, they were exporting the blueprint. Chinese state-owned construction giants, CSCEC, CREC, and their subsidiaries are now building cities, highways, ports, and railways on every inhabited continent on Earth. In Africa, Chinese firms have built or are building new capital cities in Egypt, Nigeria, and Zambia. In Southeast Asia, entire new urban districts are rising on Chinese construction methodologies, Chinese prefabrication systems, and Chinese smart city technology stacks. In the Middle East, the Saudi government's NEOM project, a planned city of 1 million people in the desert, is drawing directly from the Shenzhen playbook on master planning, infrastructure sequencing, and technology integration. The world is not just studying Shenzhen, it is hiring the people who built it. But this is where the story gets complicated, because the Shenzhen model runs on conditions that most of the world cannot simply purchase: state ownership of land, the ability to relocate populations without litigation, a centralized government that can hold a 50-year vision across multiple political generations without it being dismantled by the next election cycle, a labor pool of hundreds of millions of people willing to move from rural provinces to construction sites on short notice. These are not conditions you can import in a contract. Which means that for the developing world, the Shenzhen model is both a gift and a question. The technology can be transferred. The construction systems can be replicated. The financing often provided directly by Chinese state banks can be arranged. But the deeper architecture that made Shenzhen possible, that lives in a political and social system that most nations adopting the blueprint do not have and may never have. And yet the cities are rising anyway. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that Shenzhen forces the world to confront. Speed works. Centralized planning, when it is competent and long-sighted, works. Building infrastructure for the city you intend to have, rather than the city you currently have, works. The results are sitting there. 12 million people deep, $560 billion a year, on land that was farmland when your parents were born. You can agree or disagree with how China built Shenzhen. You can admire the engineering and challenge the politics. You can question the cost to the workers who built it and the residents who live under its surveillance systems. All of that is legitimate. All of that is real. But you cannot look at what stands on that coastline today. The skyline, the subway, the ports, the technology layer, the economic output, and call it anything other than what it is: the most ambitious act of deliberate city building in the history of human civilization. 40 years ago, you were standing in a fishing village. Now, you're standing in the future.